April 3, 1882. A quiet house in St. Joseph, Missouri. A man stands on a wooden chair, unarmed, straightening a crooked picture frame on the wall. It's a small, domestic moment, the kind of thing any husband does on an ordinary morning. Except this man is the most wanted outlaw in American history. He has robbed banks in broad daylight. He has derailed trains. He has been hunted for 17 years by detectives, soldiers, and bounty hunters across half the country. And right now, in this room, someone he trusts is standing behind him with a loaded revolver. In the next 10 seconds, one of the most notorious criminals the American frontier ever produced is going to die, shot in the back by a man he called a friend. This is the true story of Jesse James. Not the folk hero from the ballads. Not the Robin Hood of the movies. The real one, built out of Civil War, massacre, betrayal, and a myth so powerful it outlived the man by more than a century. The year is 1864. America is tearing itself apart. And in the rolling hills of Clay County, Missouri, a 16-year-old boy is about to become one of the most dangerous men in the history of the American frontier. His name is Jesse Woodson James. Most people know the legend, the bank robber, the train robber, the man who became a folk hero. But almost nobody knows how he got there. Because before Jesse James was an outlaw, he was a farm boy. A quiet, church-going kid raised on a hemp farm by a Baptist preacher father who left for the California gold rush and never came home. He died out west, and Jesse never saw him again. His mother, Zerelda James, was not a woman to be underestimated. Fierce, sharp-tongued, and fiercely loyal to her sons, she remarried twice, and the family scraped by through the tension of pre-Civil War Missouri, a border state caught between the Union and the Confederacy, a place where neighbor turned against neighbor long before the first shots of the war were even fired. This mattered. Because Missouri wasn't just divided, it was violent. Bands of pro-Confederate guerrilla fighters called bushwhackers waged a brutal, dirty war against Union soldiers and pro-Union civilians. This wasn't the organized warfare of Gettysburg or Antietam. This was a war of ambushes, house burnings, and revenge killings between people who had grown up as neighbors. And it was into this chaos that Jesse's older brother, Frank James, rode first, joining William Quantrill's Raiders, a guerrilla band responsible for one of the most horrifying massacres of the entire Civil War, the Lawrence Massacre, where over 150 men and boys in Lawrence, Kansas were dragged from their homes and shot in front of their families while the town burned around them. Jesse wanted in. And in 1864, at just 16 years old, he got his wish, joining a splinter group led by Bloody Bill Anderson, a man so violent that even other guerrillas feared him. Anderson's men didn't just kill Union soldiers. They scalped them. They mutilated bodies and left them as warnings for anyone who crossed them. This was the world that shaped Jesse James, not saloons and stagecoaches, but a guerrilla war with almost no rules, where killing became simply what you did to survive another day. There's a story, likely embellished over the decades but repeated often, that during this period Jesse was involved in the notorious Centralia massacre in September 1864, where Anderson's men stopped a train, pulled roughly 24 unarmed Union soldiers off it, and executed them on the spot. Whether or not the teenage Jesse pulled a trigger that day, he rode with the men who did, and he absorbed their code completely. Mercy was for people who could afford it, and men like them couldn't. By the time the Civil War ended in 1865, Jesse was 19 years old. And here's the tragedy hiding underneath the legend: the war had changed him permanently. He rode into a Union checkpoint that year to surrender, waving a white flag, and was shot by Union soldiers anyway, nearly dying from a bullet wound to the lung. He survived, nursed back to health in part by a cousin named Zerelda Mims, a young woman he would later marry. But something in him had already decided that peace was not going to be offered to men like him, no matter how many white flags he waved. So when Missouri tried to return to normal life after the war, farms, courts, banks, trains, Jesse and Frank James, along with their old guerrilla friends the younger brothers, did not put down their guns. On February 13, 1866, a group of men rode into Liberty, Missouri, and walked into the Clay County Savings Association. They didn't sneak in. They didn't wear masks in the way later robbers would. They walked in like they owned the place, drew their revolvers, and cleaned out the vault, making off with roughly $60,000, an almost unthinkable sum of money for the time, equivalent to well over $1 million today. As they rode out of town, they shot and killed an innocent 19-year-old college student named George Wymore, simply because he happened to be in the street. Historians consider this the first daylight armed bank robbery in American history during peacetime. And while Jesse James's direct involvement in this exact robbery is debated by historians, what's not debated is what came next. For the next 16 years, banks and trains across Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, Kentucky, and beyond would be hit again and again by a gang that moved like ghosts, the James Younger Gang. And Jesse, still in his early 20s, was already becoming something more dangerous than an outlaw. He was becoming a myth. Here's what made Jesse James different from every other bandit riding across the frontier: he understood something almost no other outlaw of his era grasped. Public image. After the war, resentment against Northern banks and railroad companies ran deep across the former Confederacy and border states. Banks foreclosed on farms. Railroads seized land through legal trickery and crushed small farmers with unfair rates. To a struggling Missouri farmer who'd lost everything in the war, a bank getting robbed didn't feel like a crime, it felt like justice, or at least like somebody was finally hitting back at the institutions that had ruined them. Jesse James understood this, and he exploited it ruthlessly. He began writing letters to newspapers, framing himself and his gang as persecuted ex-Confederates fighting back against corrupt institutions. A sympathetic newspaper editor named John Newman Edwards published these letters and wrote glowing editorials comparing Jesse to a modern-day Robin Hood, a comparison that had almost nothing to do with reality. There is no solid historical evidence that Jesse James ever gave stolen money to the poor. He kept it. He used it to buy land, support his family, and fund the next robbery. But the legend didn't need to be true. It just needed to be believable to people who wanted a hero, and Edwards's newspaper columns made sure that hero had a name and a face. Meanwhile, the actual robberies grew bolder and bloodier. In 1873, the gang pulled off something no one had attempted before in the American West: they derailed a moving train. Near Adair, Iowa, they pried up a section of railroad track and tied a rope to it, waiting in the darkness. When the Rock Island Express came barreling through, the locomotive flew off the rails and crashed violently. The engineer, John Rafferty, was killed instantly, crushed beneath the wreckage of his own engine. The gang stormed the wreck, robbed the terrified passengers at gunpoint, cracked open the safe, and vanished into the night before any real pursuit could organize. Train robbery as a criminal art form had just been born in America, and Jesse James was its inventor. For the rest of the 1870s, banks and trains across the Midwest lived in genuine terror of the James Younger Gang. Newspapers ran breathless coverage of every new heist. Wanted posters plastered post offices from Missouri to Texas. And the newly formed Pinkerton National Detective Agency, essentially America's first modern private investigation and manhunt organization, made capturing Jesse James one of their top priorities in the entire country. Alan Pinkerton himself reportedly took the case personally, treating it almost as a matter of professional pride after his agents kept failing to bring the gang in. The Pinkertons' pursuit turned genuinely dark in January 1875. Acting on a tip that Jesse and Frank were hiding at their mother's farmhouse in Missouri, Pinkerton agents surrounded the property at night and threw an incendiary device through a window, intending, they claimed afterward, only to illuminate the house so they could see their targets. Instead, it exploded. The blast tore off the arm of Jesse's mother, Zerelda, and killed his 9-year-old half-brother, Archie Samuel, who had been sleeping in the room. Public opinion, already sympathetic to Jesse, turned into outright fury against the Pinkertons and the authorities. Missouri lawmakers actually debated a bill to grant amnesty to Jesse and Frank James, framing them as ex-Confederate soldiers being unfairly hunted by a private detective agency that had just killed a child. The bill narrowly failed. But it showed just how deep the myth had taken root. A mass-murdering bank and train robber, and state legislators were seriously considering forgiving him entirely, in writing, on the floor of the Missouri legislature. Then came the beginning of the end, Northfield, Minnesota, September 7, 1876. The gang rode into town to rob the First National Bank, expecting an easy score in a state where nobody knew their faces. Instead, the townspeople, armed, alert, and furious, fought back in a way almost no bank in the gang's history had managed. Citizens grabbed rifles and shotguns from the hardware store and opened fire from windows and rooftops across the street. 2 gang members, Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell, were killed in the street within minutes. The younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, were shot to pieces, riddled with bullets, and eventually captured after a manhunt through the Minnesota countryside. Jesse and Frank barely escaped alive, riding for nearly 2 weeks through swampland and farm country while wounded, exhausted, and pursued by the largest posse Minnesota had ever assembled. Northfield shattered the gang. The youngers went to prison for life, effectively ending careers that had run alongside Jesse's for over a decade. And Jesse James, now in his early 30s, was more alone and more hunted than he had ever been. But he didn't stop. He rebuilt a new, smaller gang and kept robbing trains through 1879, 1880, and into 1881, years that were noticeably bloodier and more desperate than before. Trust among his own men was collapsing. Jesse had become paranoid, controlling, and increasingly willing to kill his own associates if he suspected betrayal. One former gang member, Ed Miller, simply vanished after riding out with Jesse alone one day. Historians widely believe Jesse killed him over suspected disloyalty. Another associate, Tucker Basham, was arrested and began cooperating with authorities, and Jesse reportedly considered him a marked man from that point forward. And it was that paranoia, that exact fear of betrayal, that would ultimately get him killed. By 1882, Jesse James was living under a fake name, Thomas Howard, in a quiet house in St. Joseph, Missouri, with his wife Z and their 2 children. On the surface, he looked like an ordinary family man. He attended a local Baptist church occasionally, chatted with neighbors, and even reportedly enjoyed playing with his children in the yard. But Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden had made ending the James gang's reign a personal mission, working closely with the railroad companies, who had lost enormous sums to the gang over the years, to offer a massive reward, $10,000 for Jesse James, dead or alive, an almost unimaginable bounty for the era. Living with Jesse at this time were 2 brothers, Charlie and Robert Ford. Charlie had ridden with Jesse on actual robberies and was trusted completely. Jesse trusted Robert nearly as much, inviting him into his home, sharing meals with him, even sleeping under the same roof. What Jesse didn't know was that Robert Ford had secretly been in contact with Governor Crittenden's representatives for weeks, negotiating in near total secrecy to betray Jesse in exchange for the reward money and a pardon for his own past crimes connected to the gang. On the morning of April 3, 1882, inside the quiet house in St. Joseph, Jesse James did something almost eerily symbolic. He noticed a framed needlepoint on the wall was crooked, reading, "God bless our home." In a house full of armed, hunted men, Jesse did something he almost never did. He unbuckled his gun belt and set it aside, not wanting to be seen wearing weapons inside his own home in front of the Ford brothers that morning. Then he climbed onto a chair to straighten the picture, turning his back completely to the room. Robert Ford drew his revolver and shot Jesse James in the back of the head at point-blank range. Jesse was 34 years old. He died almost instantly, collapsing off the chair in front of his own wife and children, who came running at the sound of the gunshot. What happened next revealed everything about how thoroughly the legend had already consumed the man. Robert Ford did not go into hiding in shame. He and his brother immediately sent a telegram to the governor and turned themselves in, fully expecting to be hailed as heroes, collect their reward, and be celebrated across the country as the men who finally brought down America's most dangerous outlaw. Instead, the American public turned on them, hard, almost overnight. Robert Ford, instead of being celebrated as the man who ended the reign of a violent multiple murderer, was branded a coward and a traitor across newspapers nationwide. A folk ballad was written almost immediately, the Ballad of Jesse James, with the now famous line calling Ford, "that dirty little coward, who shot Mr. Howard, and laid Jesse James in his grave." The ballad spread by word of mouth across the entire country within months, cementing Ford's public identity forever as a backstabber rather than a lawman's hero. Ford spent the rest of his short life as a hated man, drifting from town to town, running saloons and gambling halls, and even reenacting the killing on small stages for paying audiences, essentially performing his own infamy for money because it was the only thing people wanted from him. He never escaped the shadow of what he'd done. 9 years later, in 1892, in a saloon he ran in Creede, Colorado, a man named Edward O'Kelly walked in and shot Robert Ford dead with a double-barreled shotgun, a killing some historians believe was at least partly motivated by the same public hatred that had followed Ford since 1882. Ford died almost exactly a decade after killing Jesse James, having spent his entire remaining life. Jesse's funeral in Missouri drew thousands of curious onlookers, far more than most political figures of the era could have attracted. His mother, the fierce and unshakable Zerelda, buried him in the yard of the family farm rather than a public cemetery, reportedly so she could watch over his grave herself and prevent anyone from digging it up for trophies, souvenirs, or bounty verification, grave robbing of famous outlaws being an actual documented concern at the time. She would reportedly charge visitors a small fee to view the grave for years afterward, one final piece of frontier hustle from a family that had built an entire mythology out of violence and legend. So what do we actually make of Jesse James, once you strip away all the ballads and the dime novels and the Hollywood films? He was not Robin Hood. He never redistributed stolen wealth to struggling farmers in any documented way. He was a teenage guerrilla fighter shaped by some of the most brutal violence of the Civil War, who never learned, or never chose, to put that violence down when the war ended. He killed innocent bystanders, from a college student in Liberty to a train engineer in Iowa. He orchestrated the deaths of railroad workers and civilians across multiple states over nearly 2 decades. He was, by any honest modern accounting, a serial armed robber and multiple murderer who happened to be extremely good at controlling his own narrative in the press, arguably America's first true master of criminal public relations, decades before anyone had a name for that skill. And yet, the myth survived him by more than a century, because it was never really about Jesse James the person at all. It was about a defeated South looking for a hero after the humiliation of the Civil War. It was about ordinary people who resented powerful banks and railroads and desperately wanted to believe someone was fighting back on their behalf, even if the fighting mostly benefited the fighter himself. Jesse James simply had the audacity, and the cold nerve, to let an entire nation believe that fantasy, right up until the moment a man he trusted, a man eating at his table, put a bullet in the back of his head over a reward check. That's the true story of Jesse James. Not the legend on the movie poster, the real one, written in guerrilla warfare, betrayal, greed, and blood, and ending not in a blaze of glory shootout, but with a crooked picture frame and a bullet from behind.